Thank you, Marissa. Hi, everyone. My name is Nancy Duchesneau. I'm a Senior P12 Research Associate at the Education Trust's National Office in DC. I lead our work on social, emotional, and academic development. I am very excited to be sharing this information with you all today. I want to start by just giving a framing of what we're going to do in this session. I'm going to give a brief framing around how we think about social, emotional, and academic development here at the Education Trust. And just a note, sometimes I might say SEED instead of social, emotional, and academic development just because it's really long. It's just an acronym for it. And then I'm going to talk about a new tool that we just released last week that helps advocates and policymakers look at how their state is doing on these issues, and talk about how we can use this scan for advocacy. And then of course, I'll take questions at the end. So as Marissa said, today in this session, I'll be talking about a few different pieces of the dimensions. One is around teaching quality and diversity. Another is around empowering rigorous content. Another is around positive and inviting school climate, as well as student supports and interventions. And so I want to start this by just giving a very clear statement that the science of learning and development shows that all learning is inherently social and emotional. And this means that whether we feel like we belong, matter, whether we have strong relationships, and whether we're emotionally well, all matter for how we engage in academic content. And I'm going to give an example of this throughout the presentation to highlight that. And before I give this example, I just want to note that while this particular example is fiction, the example is derived from real interviews that were conducted with students of color across the country several years ago. And so these are things that happen on a daily basis to students, especially students of color. So I'd like for you all to imagine Grace. She's a young Black girl, and she's very excited to be returning to in-person learning on the first day of her senior year of high school. She's looking forward to seeing her teachers and her friends, and she's looking forward to applying to colleges this year. And while school was virtual because of the pandemic, she did try really hard to keep up with her academics, and she maintained very good grades. Unfortunately, with COVID-19, her grandmother passed away this past year, and her family has had some financial struggles. But Grace has actually stepped up a lot at home, doing extra chores around the house, getting involved in her community. She marched in Black Lives Matter marches, sewed masks for her community. And so Grace walks into her homeroom class on the first day, and her teacher notices her hair twists and says, "That hairstyle is prohibited. You'll need to go to the office." And so Grace gets upset. But she walks to the office and she receives a warning that if she doesn't change her hairstyle before tomorrow, she's going to be sent home from school. So then Grace goes to her first period class, AP History, and she notices as she walks in that she is the only Black student in the class. She pauses, and the teacher looks at her and says, "This is AP History. Do you belong in this class?" And Grace gets pretty upset at this microaggression. But she says yes. She sits down and she reminds herself that she's going to ace this class. And the teacher responds, "Well, you don't need to get an attitude about it." And during lunch, Grace is recognizing that she's having a rough day and that she might need a little bit of support given everything that's happening at home and at school that day. And so she goes in search of her school counselor, but they're too busy to see her. So later that day, Grace participates in a social and emotional learning program that's run by her homeroom teacher, who starts off by discussing a little pointedly at Grace that it's really important for students to control their emotions and make responsible decisions. And so understandably, Grace is pretty frustrated. So when we hear about social and emotional learning, often what they're talking about is learning specific competencies or skills like these. And yes, we do want students to learn to manage their emotions and behavior, to make responsible decisions, to believe in their ability to achieve, absolutely. And because those skills are so valuable, more than 90% of schools and districts say they're working to support the social and emotional learning of their students. And while they're almost always well-intentioned, too often the approaches used are about identifying a skill or competence that kids allegedly don't have or don't have enough of, and so are based in building these skills without clear attention to the learning environments that influence social and emotional development. And so as you could see from Grace's experience though, the social and emotional learning programs that focus exclusively on teaching these skills isn't the whole picture we need to look at. And frankly, it's not fair to be telling students of color to control their anger without also confronting the systemic racism that is understandably anger-inducing. And this is worrisome because, as Grace's story shows, context really matters. The racism Grace experienced, the responsibilities Grace had outside of school, cultural background, all influence social emotional development and whether teachers view Grace as competent in social and emotional skills. I could give another example from my own experience on this is that I grew up in a Korean household where I was taught that respect is shown to adults not by looking at them in the eye and engaging in conversation, but actually by looking down and quietly agreeing. And yet in school, my white teachers in particular always thought that I was too shy, didn't know how to build relationships, just because I didn't conform to their expected norms. But instead, it would have been really helpful if my teachers had built relationships with me and my family to really understand our cultural background and norms. But this year especially, we really need to take context into account because of the stress we've all experienced from the COVID-19 pandemic, the tumultuous politics, our national reckoning with racial injustice, and these will all certainly influence the well-being of students, especially students of color as they re-enter classrooms. And so when schools use approaches that don't use an explicit equity lens or don't acknowledge the role of students' racial and cultural experiences in social emotional development, or just fail to address the processes and structures in schools that systemically disadvantage students of color, students from low-income backgrounds and other youth, or treat social and emotional learning as separate from academics, then we see something like Grace's experience play out, where students are told that they're not meeting social and emotional norms when actually they're excelling at those skills. And doing these sorts of programs without addressing the environment that students are in can actually do more harm than good. And so with that in mind, with these concerns in mind, we released a report last year of a qualitative study in which students and families of color across the country discussed their experiences and what schools should be doing to support social, emotional, and academic development, or SEED, for students of color. And we learned that they're worried too. Many students of color already have and are expected by society to learn advanced social and emotional skills because of the context of race. Grace's control of her emotions when her AP teacher asked if she belonged in an AP class, or her continued belief in her ability to achieve in that class, for example, and yet they're not recognized for that social and emotional competence. And so our participants often express that there was a gap between schools and their communities and a misunderstanding of students' experiences. And what's more, our participants credited racial, ethnic, and cultural identity development as the core of social, emotional, and academic development, but noted that this is too often missing from conversations around social emotional learning. And so often our participants expressed that they frankly just didn't trust schools to explicitly teach these skills without first addressing the systemic racism and adult bias in schools. And I have just a quick audio clip from a student from that study for you all. So this really requires us to shift our focus. Currently, we see a disproportionate focus on trying to fix kids by teaching them social emotional skills. And we need to shift to really broadening our focus to address the context and the learning environments in which students are developing. So in our report, we discuss 6 key policy recommendations to really create environments that support integrated and equity-focused social, emotional, and academic development. First is around providing meaningful professional development and supports, including around anti-racism, engaging students, families, and communities as full partners, diversifying the educator workforce, ensuring equitable access to and supports for success in rigorous and culturally sustaining coursework, providing access to integrated wraparound services and supports, and co-developing inclusive discipline and dress code policies. But talking about these recommendations is actually more useful if we really know where states are in terms of these policies. So thankfully, I was able to look to the work of my colleague, Eric Duncan. He did a 50-state scan last year on state policies and teacher diversity. And so we were able to think about using that as a model for doing the other 5 policy issue areas that we recommend. And so we partnered with CASEL, which is the leading organization in social and emotional learning, to conduct 50-state scans to understand how states are improving their efforts to support SEED. And at EdTrust, we're focusing on scanning, we scan these policy areas with CASEL's input on the specific policies and how they relate to social and emotional learning. And so we finally released it last week, and we'll have some time during the session to go through the website tool together to explore how we could use this for advocacy. Now, before we actually dive in, I do want to just break down the state role in this, specifically why states are so important. States actually have so much power over what schools and districts are doing around these issue areas. And so we break this down in the tool in 3 main state levers. One is around creating state goals, because doing that and making it clear to districts and schools that this is a priority encourages them to really make the effort to make changes around these issues. A second is around providing policies, guidance, and funding in order to make sure that state or schools and districts have the capacity to make these changes happen. And a third is around data collection and public reporting, because we need to be able to measure these issues to make sure that improvement is actually happening over time. Now, when we go back to Grace's example, we think about her first incident in the school where she was told that her hair was unacceptable. There are actually quite a few harmful discipline policies, and states can really ban some of these. So let me take us out of this presentation and bring you to the tool. Okay. All right, and the tool should be, the link for this should be dropped in your chat so that you can follow along if you'd like. So welcome to the SeedScan. We have down here, when you scroll down, the 5 main issue areas: discipline, professional development, rigorous and culturally sustaining curriculums, student, family, and community engagement, and wraparound services. Now, what you can do is you can actually click on your individual state. Let's say, for example, let's take a look at Washington, for example. Now, in discipline, under policies, guidance, and funding, we can see that Washington prohibits local districts from adopting a number of harmful disciplinary policies and actions. One of those is that by passing the Crown Act, schools and districts are not allowed to discriminate against students based on hair. So in a state like Washington, Grace may not have experienced being sent to the office because of her hair. Let's think about another example with Grace, where we think about how Grace walked into her AP history classroom and she was the only Black girl in the class. Now we know that in many cases, students of color are not equitably enrolled in advanced coursework, but there are actions that states can take. For example, Illinois, we want to go back there to all of the states. Under rigorous and culturally sustaining curriculum and under policies, guidance, and funding, we can see that Illinois actually will require automatic enrollment in advanced coursework starting in 2023. And this means that students will be automatically enrolled in AP or IB or dual enrollment based off of their test scores or other less subjective and biased measures. So rather than simply being told by a person in the school that they are or are not able to enter that classroom. However, if we want to compare it, for example, to your state, I do want to note that there is a compare two states option here that you can compare Illinois to your own state on any of these policy areas. So for example, if you're in California, we can see that California does not require districts to equitably enroll students in advanced coursework. Now let's think about, for example, Grace's experience being asked by her teacher whether or not she belonged in an AP classroom. Now, we know that all educators, everyone, has some internal bias that we need to work towards, right? But all adults need support with that as well. And so Minnesota, for example, under professional development and policies, guidance, and funding, actually requires all educators renewing their license to complete cultural competency training that the state provides. And the state provides additional funding for programming for educators to support their ability to teach diverse learners, including an anti-racism program. And so we can see that here, where we ask, does the state provide guidance and funding? And I should also note that you can also click on each of these links to find the information where we made these determinations. And finally, let's think about how Grace was self-aware enough to go find her school counselor, and yet that school counselor was too busy. Now, unfortunately, no state currently mandates the American School Counselor Association's recommended ratio of 250 students per one school counselor. And in many cases across the country, it's double, triple, even quadruple that. However, if we look at Delaware, under wraparound services and policies, guidance, and funding, we ask, does the state mandate each school to have a specified and adequate 250 to 1 ratio? Now, Delaware doesn't yet, but they're probably the closest we've come that we've seen, in that they will require this ratio for grades K through 5, and that will be phased in over the next few years. So I think one of the core pieces that we're hoping this scan will be helpful for is actually identifying where states really need to focus their resources and their policies to make sure that they are supporting students' social, emotional, and academic development. And one of the ways that states can do that is with their ARP dollars. So let me go back to my presentation. So one of the examples that we thought was quite strong, and I should also note that a lot of these pieces here are around our wraparound supports, which we're actually going to have another session later today around multi-tiered systems of support. So stick around if you really want to learn more about these issues. Delaware, we thought did a particularly good job in dedicating their ARP dollars in ways that would support students' well-being. One is that they will be providing professional development and technical assistance to implement multi-tiered systems of support, or MTSS, including a focus on interconnected systems framework and positive behavior interventions and supports. So what this means is that they're really creating the structure to make sure that all students receive a baseline support, and then there are ways to make sure that the students who need more supports receive those supports. Secondly, Delaware has a statewide training on culturally responsive education that they're using the ARP dollars for, as well as a mentoring program for foster youth, which is absolutely critical for both building relationships as well as accelerating learning. And lastly, Delaware has a school community learning program. And so this is actually a year-round out-of-school time program, and it'll be a partnership between a Title I eligible school and at least one community partner. So this will be really important for providing holistic supports for students, as well as making sure that community involvement is happening within the school. So I wanted to give you all a little bit of time to kind of play around with the tool. So I'm going to give you all about 10 minutes. And I'd love for you all to take a look at your state in the tool. And I have a couple of poll questions that I'll be asking over the next 5 to 10 minutes. So I'll give you all a moment to go find your state on the tool. Okay, so looking at your state, you'll see the drop down of the 5 different issue areas. And my first question for you is, what issue area is your state strongest in? You should see a poll pop up for you. Okay, looks like about half of you have responded so far. And it looks like professional development and student family community engagement and maybe wraparound services are the ones that your states are strongest in so far. Great. Okay, engagement pulled ahead. So if you wanted to take a deeper dive into where your state is strong, you can do that. Or we can actually go in the opposite direction now. So I'm curious to know what issue area is your state weakest in right now? Let me pop up that poll. Okay, so what issue area does your state need the most improvement in? Okay. Looks like a little over half of you have responded with discipline and rigorous and culturally sustaining curriculum as the weakest areas for your state. Now, I am particularly not surprised around the curriculum piece because I think that's honestly one of the weakest areas across states. But it's so important that students are able to learn in a way that is reflective of their lived experiences and make sure that they're able to connect what they're learning in the classroom to their experiences outside of school. Now, finally, I'd like for you to go into that issue area that was the weakest for your state, the one that your state needed the most improvement in, and look at the goals questions. So make sure that you're clicked on the tab for goals. And then I'd like to know, for that issue area, does your state have clear goals around that issue area? So a little over half of you have responded, and overwhelmingly the answer is no, they do not have clear goals. But it's really important for states to make those goals clear so that districts and schools can make that a priority. But let's move on from that. And let's think about the policies, the guidance, and the funding that the state is providing around that weak issue area. And I'd love to know, and this is not a poll because it's a very open-ended question, so please put your answer in the chat. If you go into the policies, guidance, and funding section for that weak area for your state, where do you think that states should be putting their ARP dollars to support this issue area? Is it around one particular policy area in there, or is it multiple? And if so, what are they? So again, I'm curious if you could put in the chat, in that issue area that is weakest for your state, if you look at the policies, guidance, and funding, where do you think that your state should be putting their ARP dollars to use? Hi, Penny. Exclusionary discipline. Kentucky has not banned corporal punishment and has insufficient parameters around the use of restraint. Lack of support with positive discipline practices for districts. Funding for schools to adopt curricula for core subjects that integrate social justice material. Absolutely. Selecting standards aligned culturally sustaining curricula, and automatically enrolling students in advanced coursework. Thanks, Ahava. Okay. So I just wanted to take the last 5 minutes of this presentation to see if there are any questions that I could answer for you. Feel free to drop them in the chat. Okay, well, if there are no questions, feel free to reach out to me. Oh, can you show the 6 policy recommendations? Yeah, I sure can. Oops. These are the 6 policy recommendations. If you go to the SEED report, you can see all 6 of them. Or if you go to the SeedScan, there are 5 of them that are up there on the SeedScan, and the 6th is actually a teacher diversity scan that is on its own. Is there a state that's modeling good SEL practice policies and procedures? So I think one of the really interesting things about doing this scan is that I've learned that most states are doing some things well, but there are no states that are doing everything well. I think there's a lot of growth that needs to happen across the country. And I'm hoping that this tool will be helpful in identifying both the strengths as well as the areas for improvement. And by being able to identify other states that are doing things well, we can look to them for examples and bright spots. So the methodology is actually located at the very bottom of the first page of the SeedScan that talks about how we did the scanning. There's also, if you go into, one second, let me see if I can just share it with you. So if you go to the first page of the SeedScan and scroll down to the bottom, there is information about the analysis. Additionally, there is a promising seed policies and practices that'll show you where states are meeting these criteria and some best practices that we would like to lift. But if you have more questions about the methodology, please feel free to reach out to me. I'm happy to support answering any of those questions.